The fluorescent lights of Memorial Hospital's fourth floor hummed their usual monotonous tune as Sarah Chen adjusted her scrubs for the third time that morning. Her hands trembled slightly. They always did on her first day in a new ward. At 26, she'd been a registered nurse for only 2 years, and the weight of responsibility still made her stomach clench with equal parts excitement and terror. She'd specifically requested the cardiology unit, not because it was prestigious, but because it was quieter than the ER, less confrontational than surgery. Sarah had always been the girl who ate lunch alone in the break room, who rehearsed conversations in her head a dozen times before speaking up in meetings, who felt her cheeks burn crimson whenever anyone looked at her too long. But there was one thing about Sarah that most people never discovered. Hidden behind her shy demeanor and downcast eyes, a secret talent that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with love. When Sarah was 8 years old, her younger brother Marcus had lost his hearing after a severe illness. While her parents had initially struggled with the diagnosis, Sarah had thrown herself into learning American Sign Language with the fierce determination only a protective older sister could muster. By the time she was 12, she was fluent. By 15, she was interpreting at her brother's parent-teacher conferences. By 20, it had become as natural to her as breathing. The morning shift had been unremarkable until room 412 appeared on her patient roster. Eleanor Vanderberg, age 68, post-cardiac catheterization, stable condition. Sarah gathered the medication tray and chart, knocked softly, and pushed open the door. The private room was filled with late morning sunlight, and in the bed sat a petite woman with silver hair styled in an elegant bob. She wore a silk bed jacket over her hospital gown, and her eyes, sharp and intelligent, fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made the young nurse's practiced smile falter. "Good morning." "Mrs. Vanderberg," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Sarah, and I'll be your nurse today. I need to check your vitals and administer your morning medications." The woman's face remained impassive, her eyes tracking Sarah's movements but offering no response. Sarah felt her cheeks warm, assuming the patient was simply one of those wealthy, dismissive types who looked through service workers as if they were invisible. She'd encountered them before, people who wore their money like armor, who made her feel even smaller than she already felt. But as Sarah approached the bed, she noticed something. The woman's eyes weren't dismissive, they were searching. Darting between Sarah's face and her hands, a slight furrow of frustration creasing her forehead. On the bedside table, Sarah spotted a notepad and pen, several notes written in shaky handwriting. "Need water." "Where is my call button?" "When can I see doctor?" Recognition dawned like sunrise. Without thinking, without the usual overthinking that paralyzed her in social situations, Sarah set down the tray and lifted her hands. "Good morning," she signed, her fingers flowing through the familiar patterns. "My name is Sarah. I'm your nurse. Are you deaf?" The transformation in Eleanor Vanderberg's face was instantaneous. Her eyes, which had been guarded and tired, suddenly blazed with relief and something that looked almost like joy. "Yes," she signed back, her movements sharp and grateful. "Yes, finally! I've been here since yesterday evening and no one could understand me. The nurses have all been kind, but I felt so isolated, so frustrated. You sign?" "I do," Sarah signed, a genuine smile breaking across her face, the kind of smile that rarely appeared in her interactions with strangers. "My brother is deaf." "How are you feeling? Any pain?" For the next 20 minutes, Sarah conducted the most thorough patient assessment of her career. Not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because for the first time in days, she forgot to be self-conscious. Eleanor asked questions about her medication, her condition, her prognosis, and Sarah answered each one with a detail and patience she rarely showed when verbal communication made her anxiety spike. They talked about Eleanor's grandchildren, her garden, her fear of hospitals. Sarah shared stories about Marcus, now a successful software developer, who had taught her that disability was just a different way of experiencing the world. "You remind me of my son," Eleanor signed, her expression softening. "He always takes time to really see people, to understand what they need rather than what's convenient to give." Sarah felt her cheeks redden at the compliment. That's kind of you to say, but I'm not doing anything special. I'm just doing my job. No, Eleanor signed with emphasis. You're doing it with your heart. There's a difference. Sarah left the room feeling something unfamiliar, a sense of competence, of having genuinely connected with another human being. She didn't notice the tall figure in the expensive charcoal suit who had been standing just outside the door, partially obscured by the hallway corner, his phone forgotten in his hand as he'd watched the entire interaction through the open door. Alexander Vanderberg had built a tech empire worth $3 billion before his 40th birthday. He'd been featured on magazine covers, interviewed by major networks, courted by politicians and celebrities. People usually wanted something from him: an investment, a job, a connection, a photo. He'd developed a sixth sense for identifying motives, for seeing through false kindness to the calculation beneath. It was why he'd arrived at the hospital early, incognito, to check on his mother before the staff knew who he was. He wanted to see how they treated her when they thought no one important was watching. What he'd just witnessed had shaken something loose in his carefully constructed worldview. This slight, obviously shy nurse with her downcast eyes and trembling hands had given his mother something no amount of money could buy: dignity, connection, understanding. She hadn't known Eleanor was a Vanderberg, mother to one of the most powerful CEOs in the country. She'd just seen a woman who needed help and had offered it without hesitation, without fanfare, without any expectation of recognition. Alexander waited until Sarah disappeared down the hallway before entering his mother's room. Eleanor's face lit up at the sight of her son, but even as he hugged her carefully, mindful of her IV lines, he could see the difference in her. The tense frustration that had lined her face yesterday was gone, replaced by a peaceful contentment. "She's wonderful," Eleanor signed to him. "That nurse Sarah, she signs Alexander. She spoke to me like I was a person, not a problem to be solved. She listened to my fears about the procedure. She's been here for less than an hour, and she's done more for my peace of mind than 2 days in this place." Alexander nodded, filing away the information. "I'm glad you have someone who can communicate with you properly. I should have arranged for an interpreter." "No," Eleanor signed firmly. "What Sarah gave me wasn't translation. It was compassion. There's a difference." Over the next 3 days, Alexander found reasons to visit the hospital at different times, always when his mother had mentioned Sarah would be on shift. He observed from a distance as the shy nurse transformed in his mother's presence. The woman who could barely make eye contact with doctors became animated and expressive when signing. She brought Eleanor books from the hospital library, stayed late to explain test results in careful detail, and once, he noticed, brought in a photo of her brother to show his mother. Alexander also noticed other things: how Sarah ate lunch alone reading battered paperback novels, how other nurses sometimes spoke over her in meetings, how she flinched when the head cardiologist barked orders, how she seemed to shrink into herself whenever she wasn't with his mother. She was invisible to most people in the hospital, just another face in scrubs, easily overlooked and quickly forgotten. On the 4th day, Eleanor was cleared for discharge. Alexander arrived early to handle the arrangements, and as he approached his mother's room, he heard laughter, the visual kind, expressed in shaking shoulders and bright eyes. Through the door, he saw Sarah and his mother signing rapidly, their hands dancing in conversation. They were sharing stories about cooking disasters, and his mother's face held more joy than he'd seen in months. He waited until Sarah emerged. Carrying the medication tray, her eyes focused on the floor as usual. "Excuse me, Nurse Chen?" Sarah looked up, startled, and Alexander saw her eyes widen as she took in his expensive suit, his confident posture, the unmistakable aura of authority he'd long ago learned to project. "Yes, sir? Can I help you? I'm Alexander Vanderberg, Eleanor's son." The tray nearly slipped from Sarah's hands. Her face went through a rapid series of expressions: surprise, embarrassment, worry. "Oh, Mr. Vanderberg, I didn't realize. Your mother is doing wonderfully." "All her vitals are stable, and the discharge paperwork should be ready within the hour. If there's anything you need—" "There is something I need," Alexander interrupted gently. "I need to thank you. I've been watching how you've cared for my mother, and I want you to know it hasn't gone unnoticed. You gave her something money can't buy. You saw her as a person, not a patient. Not because you knew who she was, but because that's who you are. Sarah's cheeks flamed crimson. I was just doing my job, Mr. Vanderberg. Your mother is a lovely person, and it was my pleasure to care for her. That's exactly my point, Alexander said. You're excellent at your job because you care about people, not accolades or advancement. That's rare. I should know. I've spent my career evaluating talent, and genuine compassion is the hardest quality to find. He paused, reaching into his jacket pocket. My company, Vanderberg Technologies, has been developing accessibility software for the deaf and hard-of-hearing community. We're also establishing a healthcare division focused on patient advocacy and improving hospital communication systems. I'd like you to consider joining our team as a consultant. Sarah stared at him as if he'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. I don't understand. I'm just a nurse. I don't know anything about technology or consulting. I'm not qualified for something like that. You're exactly qualified, Alexander countered. You understand both the medical field and the deaf community. You know what patients need because you actually listen to them. And my mother told me you have ideas about how hospitals could better serve deaf patients, staff training, visual alert systems, standardized sign language protocols. That's the kind of expertise we need. But I'm not, Sarah began, her old insecurities flooding back. I'm not good at presentations or meetings or speaking in front of people. I can barely talk to my supervisor without my voice shaking. Alexander smiled, and for the first time, Sarah saw genuine warmth behind his CEO exterior. Some of the most brilliant minds I know are introverts. We're not asking you to become someone you're not. We're asking you to be more of who you already are. Someone who sees what others miss, who solves problems with empathy and intelligence. You can communicate beautifully when you're passionate about something, Sarah. I've seen it. The question is whether you're willing to step outside your comfort zone and help us build something that could improve thousands of lives. Sarah felt tears prickling her eyes. No one had ever spoken to her like this, as if her quietness was an asset rather than a flaw, as if her compassion was a strength rather than a vulnerability. Can I think about it? Of course. Take all the time you need. He handed her a business card. But Sarah, whatever you decide, I want you to know that what you did for my mother mattered. You made her feel seen and valued during one of the most vulnerable moments of her life. That's not nothing. That's everything. When Eleanor Vanderberg was wheeled out of Memorial Hospital that afternoon, she insisted on stopping by the nurses' station. Sarah was there, filling out charts, her head down as usual. Eleanor reached out and touched her hand, drawing her attention. Thank you, she signed. Not just for the medical care, but for treating me like a friend. You have a gift, Sarah. Don't let fear convince you to hide it. 3 weeks later, Sarah sat in her small apartment, Alexander's business card propped against her coffee mug. She'd researched Vanderberg Technologies extensively. The healthcare division was real and already making waves with innovative accessibility solutions. She'd imagined 100 scenarios, most of them ending in her failure and embarrassment. But she also kept thinking about Eleanor's words, about her brother Marcus, who'd never let his deafness define his limitations, about all the deaf patients who might feel less alone if hospitals changed their approach. With shaking hands, she picked up her phone and dialed the number on the card. Alexander answered on the second ring. Sarah, I'm glad you called. I'm terrified, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But I'd like to try. I have so many ideas, and if there's even a chance they could help people, then we'll make sure they do, Alexander said. Welcome to the team. 6 months later, Memorial Hospital implemented its first comprehensive deaf accessibility program, with Sarah Chen leading the training. She still got nervous before presentations, still felt her hands shake when addressing a room full of hospital administrators. But when she signed while she spoke, demonstrating how simple changes could transform patient experiences, her passion overrode her fear. The shy nurse who'd once eaten lunch alone now led a team of consultants, developing protocols that would eventually be adopted by hospitals across the country. On the 1-year anniversary of Eleanor's hospital stay, Alexander invited Sarah to dinner with his mother. As they signed and laughed over wine and pasta, Eleanor reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. "You know what the best part of this story is?" She signed. "It's not that my son gave you a job opportunity. It's that you reminded both of us that the most powerful force in the world isn't money or technology. It's seeing people for who they are and loving them anyway." Sarah felt tears on her cheeks. But this time she didn't hide them. She'd learned that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that quiet strength could change the world, and that sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin with the simplest act, treating another human being with dignity and kindness, even when no one important is watching. Especially then,